From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome for joining us today on a very cold day where the transportation doesn't run too well in Washington, I hear. But we're very pleased to have you here for a special presentation in the Center for the Books and Beyond series of noontime talks about new books that are pertinent in some way to the Library of Congress. The Center for the Book itself is the reading and literacy promotion arm of the Library of Congress. We were created many years ago by Daniel Borston when he was the Librarian of Congress, who wanted the Library of Congress to find a way to reach out to the general public as well as the scholarly public in book and reading promotion. And one of the ways was to create a special office that was privately funded, except for the staff of the center, which in those days, in 1977, was me. I was the founding director, to find ways to reach out, to call attention to the importance of books and reading. And we have grown considerably in these 35 plus years and have a couple of national networks of states. There are branches, not branches, but affiliates in each state that promote reading and book cultures of those states. And in those 30 years, literacy has become a more evident problem in the Library of Congress, in the world. And the Library of Congress has taken a role to try to work with other organizations to promote literacy as well. The National Book Festival, which some of you may know about, is an annual event at the Library of Congress with which the Center for the Book is closely associated. And we also sponsor these noontime talks, which, as I mentioned earlier, are aimed at new books to try to show that the results of research in not only the Library of Congress, but in libraries and institutions around the world can be a very productive, important item called the book, which is still in many ways the foundation of knowledge and learning in our society. It's just that we often have it available in many different formats now. And the idea of promoting reading books and promoting reading in every way is at the heart of the Center for the Book. These particular talks are all filmed for the library's website, so we can make them available. This is about the 12th year of this series and more than 250 such book talks, which consist of a presentation by the author, a brief question and answer period, and then a book signing, are all recorded. At least the talk part is recorded. And we do want you to know that in the question and answer period that your asking a question will really be your permission for us to use your question and answer as part of our overall presentation on our website and in other ways that we want to spread the word about the books and the importance of books, such as today's book, No Exit to Pakistan. Our author, Nan Markey, happened to be in my office today just before the presentation when the Librarian of Congress, James Billington, happened to come by, which he does not do very often in the Center for the Book office, and we were able to chat briefly, and Dr. Billington's first question to Dan was something that I had already had covered in my introduction, but it was, did you know that the Library of Congress has an office in Pakistan? And the truth is that it is one of our principal overseas acquisitions offices that was created in 1962, actually, as a result of Public Law 480. And these were funds which some of you may know about, that were made available to the U.S. government, that they had been acquired as a result of agricultural sales, and it was decided to keep the funds in the country by making use of a library acquisitions function. At the same time, offices were created in India and in Egypt, and it was the basis, really, in many ways, for further expansion in the 1980s and 90s of the Library of Congress's Foreign Acquisitions Program. We are a worldwide library. We are still supported by Congress in a generous way that enables the institution to not only collect, but also make available foreign language collections in many different formats. And in the case of Arabic, for example, we are the largest library, an Arabic library outside of Egypt, and this list grows for many of our major languages and areas of the world. So it's quite appropriate today that we have a speaker who is going to inform us not only about an area in which the Library of Congress has a direct interest, but one that is of great significance to the world today. In the book, Dan tells the story of the tragic and often strained and tormented relationship between the United States and Pakistan. And he will talk more about this topic, but I will note from our news release and from some of the reviews, the excellent reviews of his book, that everyone agrees that Pakistan's internal strife has threatened the U.S. in ways that we never had imagined, and that along with the problems of India and China in that part of the world, this is a growing problem that we are fortunate to be able to learn about from today's speaker. In looking at the reviews of the book, not only do we know that we're going to learn about Pakistani society, and also we're going to have Dan's opinions about future U.S. policies and how Washington might avoid past mistakes. But I loved the little phrase, Dan, that came from one of the reviews saying quickly, it was a one-page summary of your book. This book explains how Washington can prepare for the worst, aim for the best, and avoid past mistakes, period. I said, well, isn't that how we all try to lead our lives as well? But I think you should feel good about the reviews of the book, and we're very pleased to be able to have you here today. Dan Markey is a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council for Foreign Relations, where he specializes in security and governance issues in South Asia. From 2003 to 2007, he held the South Asia portfolio in the Secretary's policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State. Dan is a graduate of Johns Hopkins University and holds a doctorate in politics from Princeton. Prior to the government service, he taught in the Department of Politics at Princeton University, where he has served as executive director of the research program in international security. We're very pleased to educate us about the U.S., Pakistan, and the current world, Dan Markey. Dan?
Great. Thanks for the very kind and warm introduction. And thanks for coming out. It is warm in here, but I know it's very cold outside, so I appreciate it for all of you for having made the trip. Let me also just say, to echo some of the comments about the importance of books and my own concern that I have two children, a 3-year-old and an almost 5-year-old, and sometimes I worry that when they look back at their childhood, they'll say, "What did you write? A what? A book? What was that? And what was the significance of that?" I hope it's not the case, and I've kept 2 copies that someday maybe they'll actually read. Who knows? But specifically for them, because I do think that it's important. And in the acknowledgments of the book, not only do I acknowledge a variety of people who have been helpful to me, but also institutions that have seen fit to continue to support the writing of books, and grant-giving organizations in particular, but also standing here in the Library of Congress. It's also important to recognize the kind of work that's been done here to support researchers, to allow them access to an incredible facility, and to make this kind of research that is sort of, I think, unfortunately less valued, but continues to have great significance into the future. I hope my book will fit into that category, and I hope that you'll get a chance to read it either because you purchased it out front, or you buy it online, or you get it at a library. I don't much care. I would say that it is a book that will have some shelf life, I hope, because it is a book that talks about the nature of a problem relationship. And I think that for scholars of international relations, whether they're interested specifically in U.S.-Pakistan relations or if they're just interested in relationships between states, they'll find something of utility, I think, in this book for years to come. And I think also, I hope, as a guide to the possible in U.S. foreign policy. That is, the challenges that we face, the problems that we've had in terms of implementation, in terms of formulating U.S. strategies, and so on. I try to grapple with these issues in the book. But that's not really what motivated me to write the book and to write the book the way that I did. And I should put a little context here. This week, you wouldn't know it from most American newspapers, but there are some fairly significant meetings ongoing between the U.S. government and the Pakistani government. We are distracted by many other things, but the senior-most Pakistani diplomat for this civilian government, Sartaj Aziz, is here in Washington this week. He's had meetings with Secretary Kerry and the National Security Advisor Rice. He will meet, or already has, I don't know, with Secretary of Defense, and so on down the list. What this suggests to me is an effort, a very important effort on our part, that is on the U.S. side, as well as on the Pakistani side, to get back to some degree of cooperation in our relationship, which nearly ruptured in the 2011-2012 timeframe. And I'll go on, get into that a little bit more deeply, but it's a recognition of the significance to both sides of this relationship that these kinds of dialogues take place, regardless of precisely what we get out of each one. It suggests it's a signaling effort on both sides to show how significant we think the other side is. But in spite of this constructive tone, and there has been a constructive tone, there is still a deep and abiding underlying set of differences between our two countries. And that, I think, gets back very much to the title of my book and to the core of the topic of my book. Now, the title of the book, No Exit from Pakistan, draws very consciously from a much more famous publication, the Jean-Paul Sartre play from 1944, No Exit. And while you may not all be familiar with it, this is a play produced in the depths of a very difficult time and toward the end of World War II, released in Paris, and which presents us with three individuals who find themselves trapped in what seems to be a living room at first, and they begin to talk to one another, and after they do, they start to realize that it's no ordinary living room, that in fact it's hell, that they've been sent there by the devil, and that they will be there, as they put it, forever and ever and ever to torment one another. And that they're uncommonly good at doing this, that their life experience and personalities have made them very capable of touching raw nerves in each other. And as I was looking for a title of a book about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, this really struck me as an appropriate way to see it, that actually in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, we too have found that we are uncommonly good at touching raw nerves, very different on either side, but that also we're stuck with one another and that we have been for decades, whether we like it or not. There's a point in the play, in the Sartre play, where the door to this living room swings open and the characters debate whether maybe they can make a run for it. and get out of their predicament. And they realize very quickly that they can't. I think that the door, in a way, to our relationship with Pakistan looks also like it's swinging open now. It's 2014. This is a year of transition in our relationship and our activities in Afghanistan, neighboring Pakistan. Our military will be drawing down significantly, perhaps even, depending on how negotiations go, all the way to zero in Afghanistan over the next year. And Pakistanis, many of them, anticipate that this looks like a looming, as they would put it, abandonment, not just of Afghanistan, but of Pakistan as well. And part of the goal that I have in writing the book and framing it the way that I did and titling it the way that I did is to suggest that no, there is no exit from this relationship. That doesn't mean, from the relationship with Pakistan, that doesn't mean we can't reduce our military presence next door. We will, significantly. What it means is that the world is too small for us to see the bundle of challenges in Pakistan as something that we can sort of wash our hands of and move on to other global challenges, as many other global challenges as there may be. So that's why I framed the book the way that I did. And it's driven also in part by the fact that I work here in Washington. I spend some time interacting with both members of Congress, but more often with their staff members, members of the public, and other interested foreign policy watchers. And it is very clear that the past several years have been tremendously difficult ones in our relationship with Pakistan and in our global engagement more broadly, and that there is a frustration, a sense of exhaustion, and a desire to pull back from the world in many different ways. And that Pakistan is an example of this. And so I also wanted to test that proposition in this book and see what the consequences of such a pullback might be. I'm worried about it, but to also try and offer some suggestions as to alternatives. Now, the problem of no exit is certainly one that we can see ourselves. That is, we have vulnerabilities to what is in Pakistan, that is, Pakistan-based threats. And I'll talk a bit about that later, but we should also recognize that Pakistanis themselves, this is a sense of mutual vulnerability, that Pakistanis are not happy about the U.S. relationship, just as we are not particularly satisfied with our relationship with Pakistan. And I think maybe the best way to talk about this is to recount a short story of when I was in Islamabad. It happened the week after our raid on the bin Laden compound. And this was not a particularly great time to visit. And it was an especially bad time to visit because I was a guest of the U.S. Embassy, and I was supposed to be doing public outreach. And the idea of doing public outreach a week after the bin Laden raid was clearly not a great one. But we decided that I should go forward with the trip at least, and I did end up cutting it short on the recommendation of some Pakistani friends that really wasn't a good time. And there was just too much uncertainty in the relationship at that moment for some well-meaning, perhaps American, to sort of pop his head up over and say, "Hi, what would you like to know about the United States?" So we curtailed the visit a bit, but I did have an opportunity to go to one of Pakistan's, Islamabad's think tanks, and to engage with members of their former diplomatic community, military, and also more academic crowd, and to gauge their sense of the relationship at what was obviously a very difficult and frustrating time. They were angry about the U.S. raid on the bin Laden compound. They were at some level humiliated about the fact that it had happened in the first place, the way that it happened. They were frustrated with U.S. professions of partnership with Pakistan, but then not conveying to the Pakistanis what we were about to do, the sense that the United States could essentially have its way with Pakistan, have its way with Pakistan's territorial sovereignty and so on. This sense of anger and frustration was very strong. And one of the people in the room raised his hand and made the comment that we don't need you, the United States. We don't need this relationship, that we would be better off without it. And then went on to recount examples of how the United States had not done well by Pakistan, not just this latest one in the bin Laden situation, but going back decades. And I asked him in response, I said, well, what alternatives does Pakistan have? Pakistan has significant economic challenges and other security challenges. Where are your alternatives to the United States, to this relationship? And the answer came very quickly. It was China. China is routinely in Pakistan called an all-weather friend, whereas the United States is called a fair-weather friend. China is the all-weather friend or ally. And I said, okay, well, that's interesting. But I was just in Beijing a couple of months ago, and I'll tell you that my conversations with the Chinese and foreign policy experts and members of their ministry didn't lead me to think that the Chinese government wanted to step in where the United States has been and pick up where Washington might be letting off. And I said, beyond that, be careful what you wish for. China has very few friends, real friends in the world. And if you look around, one of them, for instance, North Korea, is not an example that I would imagine that Pakistan would want to follow. And of course, that wasn't a very welcome response on my part at the time, but grudgingly accepted. And I would say that over the next almost year after that, Pakistanis, their parliament, their media undertook a national debate in ways large and small about the nature of their understanding of the relationship with the United States. And ultimately, the conclusion was, we don't like it, but we're stuck with it. And I'll sort of follow on with that to say, and that takes us back to where I started, which is this week of meetings with this senior Pakistani diplomat. They are engaged in a process of, I think, a more narrow, perhaps more realistic, skeptical cooperative relationship with the United States, but one that they and their government appreciate is a necessary one for Pakistan. Now, part of the grudging acceptance of this on the Pakistani side is, as I said, related to recent activities, our war in Afghanistan, the raid on the bin Laden compound, the use of U.S. drones over Pakistani tribal areas, and the list can go on. Part of it, though, dates back decades. Pakistani anger about the United States or sense of anti-Americanism is not a new phenomenon. What we are seeing is sort of the layering on of new grievances over old, deeper bruises in the relationship. And in the book, I spend a whole chapter talking, the chapter is titled, Why Do They Hate Us? And it basically attempts to answer that question by talking about the history of the relationship going back, all the way back to the 40s and 50s. And what I find is that there are sort of three strands of anti-American sentiment that map not neatly onto this history, but map onto this history. They begin with going back to 1954, going back to a U.S. treaty with Pakistan, and the sense among, I would say, left-leaning, liberal Pakistanis, civilians, that the consequence of that early relationship was a U.S. support for Pakistan's military leaders, military dictators. And that this similar U.S. support had played out at other instances during different eras in the 1980s and again under Musharraf after 9/11, where the United States was too much in bed with Pakistan's military and too little supportive, or produced too little in the way of pressure on Pakistan's military to yield to more democratic forces, civilian forces. And from a liberal Pakistani perspective, this is seen as a deep hypocrisy, that the United States is not living up to its own principles enshrined in our own constitution in our practice of foreign policy overseas. And one Pakistani in particular made this case very firmly with me, and I talk about him in the book, a very prominent attorney, Etazaz Ahsan. He's a leader not just in the world of law, but also in politics. He's a major figure in the Pakistan People's Party, and also was a central figure in, and I'm sure you'll remember this, the black-suited lawyers protest movement against Musharraf that ultimately helped to bring him down in 2007 and 2008. And this attorney would meet with me on occasion while I worked at the State Department and also afterwards. and would make it very clear that the problem with U.S. strategy in Pakistan was that we were too much wedded to Pakistan's military leaders, and that ultimately this would be counterproductive. And in many ways, I agree. The challenge, of course, has been that, and I point this out in the book as well, that when we have needed Pakistan, for instance, after 9/11, we didn't have an option to choose a different Pakistani leader, and that this has been true at various other points throughout history. And so we've been dealt a difficult deal. We haven't always played it as well as I think we might. But this is part of the grievance. Now, liberals and left-leaning intellectuals in Pakistan form a tiny minority in the country. But they're vocal, they're highly educated, they're well-connected, very articulate, and they should be our allies. But as I've explained, they're not. They form a part of this broader anti-American sentiment. So that's one piece. Another piece, and much more prevalent in Pakistan, is what I describe as a nationalist anti-American sentiment. And this, I think, comprises more like, I don't know, you could say as much as 70, 80% of Pakistanis fall into this category. A more centrist political mood, which is angry about the United States, not so much for who we are, what we believe in, or even that hypocrisy about dealing with their military, but blames us for what they would see as a series of abandonments, of U.S. abandonments, and I talked about this earlier, not just of Afghanistan, but of Pakistan itself. And that's, in the book I talk about A.Q. Khan, and you probably heard of him, Dr. A.Q. Khan, the world's most famous nuclear proliferator. And one of the questions that I raise is why A.Q. Khan, who was pretty happily living with his wife, not a Pakistani, based in the Netherlands in the 60s, why he chose to return to Pakistan and to contribute to the development of its nuclear program in the 1970s. And the answer, as far as I can tell, was his sense of patriotism, his assessment that Pakistan needed a nuclear capability and that he could contribute to it. Now, later, he may have been driven by financial motives, by other motives, but at the outset, it was his sense that Pakistan needed help and that he could provide it. And beyond that, that the rest of the world, and including the United States, was not going to provide it and was untrustworthy. And this group of, and I think this is a very common narrative in Pakistan, this view is that the United States has left before and will leave again. And as 2014 comes, and as we're talking about this departure from Afghanistan, there is this sense is even stronger now. A final strand of anti-American sentiment. I talk about Hafiz Saeed, the head of Lashkar-e-Taiba, the terrorist organization based in Pakistan that was responsible for the 2008 Mumbai attacks that took place over our Thanksgiving weekend. This is a strand of view or attitude in Pakistan, unfortunately, that has been growing over decades. In many ways is rooted in the Afghan wars of the 1980s, but has some precursors. Has been fueled by some of the more extreme madrasas and training camps and other facilities in Pakistan that have led to what you might say in shorthand a jihadi or violent extremist mentality. Now, this is a small segment of Pakistani society, I want to be clear, but it's violent, extreme, well-organized, very vocal, and committed to its cause. So when you put all of those pieces together, you can see that this is an anger, an anti-American sentiment that is very important, that will persist, that is different from the others. You put all of these pieces together, and now you, I think, get a better sense as to where that anger post-Bin Laden raid came from, and why the acceptance of a need to work with the United States is, in most quarters in Pakistan, a grudging acceptance. Okay, so that's the Pakistani side of the ledger. Let me talk a little bit, though, about the U.S. side, because here, I think we need to think about our own vulnerabilities to Pakistan, or to Pakistan-based threats. And I begin by, first of all, trying to sketch out a profile of Pakistan itself, or a portrait of Pakistan. And I talk about it as a composite portrait of 4 different layers, sort of like what you might do as the police will do these composite drawings based on several witness accounts. And my feeling, having worked on Pakistan, is that depending on who you talk to, you get a different portrait. Not totally different, but different, stressing different features. And so I talk about 4 of these. And the first of these that I talk about is what I call a basket case. Right? This is a society that has over decades shown that it is not investing in its people, in its infrastructure, in its quality of governance, its delivery of services, and it's failing in ways. It hasn't failed, but it is failing. And I tell the story, for instance, of going to Karachi, meeting with some very wealthy businessmen who took me out to a really great lunch at a French bistro. This isn't the kind of thing you might expect happening. It doesn't happen to the average person in Pakistan, certainly. And as we're sipping our chilled cucumber soup over lunch, the lights go out. And without missing a beat, they all pull out their cell phones and put them on the table to make sort of a little flashlight kind of solutions to the problem. And then we get to the conversation, the broader conversation, the more serious conversation of it's not just that the lights go out with such regularity that nobody even cares. It's that the power to their factories is not coming on, and that this is having very significant consequences for their ability to make money and also for the national economy. And if you multiply that in the areas of education, infrastructure, roads, ports, schools, and healthcare and everything else, you find a country that isn't succeeding. And not only that, but it is growing rapidly. 200 million people, likely to be around 300 million by mid-century, growing very rapidly. So if it's unable to meet its challenges now, if it doesn't change, it's likely to get worse. Okay, so basket case. Then I talk about a garrison state. A garrison state, that is a country that is dominated by its military. And one can paint a fairly convincing portrait of Pakistan really through this lens, which is this is a country where the most powerful institution has been the military. It is the dominant institution, and it continues to be that way. And it is almost a state apart. That is, you can go into military cantonments and facilities and see not the basket case, but a well-ordered, fairly manicured, and capable mini-society within that larger society. And this has all kinds of consequences because the Pakistani military controls its defense policy, its foreign policy, and its own budgets. So this dominant military role has been an important feature. Then I talk about Pakistan as I say, a terrorist incubator. It's not just the problem of al-Qaeda, although I try to make the case that al-Qaeda it's not by happenstance that bin Laden was found in Pakistan or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was found inside of Pakistan. It's because these roots go very, very deep. Their networks run deep. Their financing networks, their personnel networks, their relationships to various organizations run deep within the state and society. It's not just that. It's that as you look to Pakistan, you see the conditions or the potential conditions for al-Qaeda's 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 to emerge if these problems are not addressed. That is, extremist sympathies, these pre-existing networks, a sense that parts of Pakistan are very remote and difficult to police or to control, and yet parts of Pakistan are completely globally interconnected. The port of Karachi, for instance, in ways that make Pakistan both difficult to access, but also make it difficult to cut off entirely. And so I talk about that challenge of terrorism. And finally, the fourth phase is perhaps the most positive, certainly the most positive one. I talk about a youthful idealist. Because as I said, Pakistan is a fast-growing society. 60% of Pakistanis today are under the age of 23. 60%. And that will be true for the next several decades. These Pakistanis, some of them, yes, are prone to the lure of extremism and violence and so on. Many of them are far more eager to get education, to get jobs, to find opportunities, and to see reform of their own state and society in positive ways. And I've seen many examples of this during my travels in Pakistan. And so this is yet another face of Pakistan. By some estimates, we're going to see a country the size of Iran, 85 million, added to Pakistan in the next several decades. If you think about it in that context, you see how significant that youth bulge really could be. When you put all these pieces together, and I'll try to wrap up here, what you see are the potential that Pakistan continues to have threatening components to it. First of all, the terrorism problem that I've talked about. Secondly, and I haven't talked much about it, but the nuclear challenge, because of course Pakistan is not just a country that has deeply embedded terrorist networks, but it also has a large or a significant and growing nuclear capability, a capability that is growing in the area of tactical nuclear weapons, very small nuclear weapons, artillery-based, that unfortunately many fear are more prone to being stolen, used in an unauthorized way in the midst of a crisis, and so on. So raise new concerns about its nuclear capabilities. And yet there's one more area of vulnerability that I think needs to be highlighted. And that is that Pakistan's size and its location make it relevant to broader U.S. concerns and interests, not just Afghanistan. We have come over the past decade to think very routinely about the AFPAC relationship, the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I make the case in the book, and then I've also got a new report that came out about a week and a half ago, that it is Asia, more broadly, where we need to see our concerns about Pakistan and also the positive potential of Pakistan. So let me sketch that out, and then I'll open to questions. Why is this? Well, if we look at Afghanistan, obviously I've already talked about our drawdown of military forces there. We are very clearly signaling our limited interest in Afghanistan over the long term. But if we look to China, if we look to India, we see an extensive and growing long-term interest where the United States has already suggested it has a commitment. The Obama administration, for instance, has talked about its rebalancing to Asia. And the question in my mind has been, so where does Pakistan fit into this? And I think the answer is twofold. Or at least right now, there hasn't been an answer, I should say, from the administration. But I think the answer will be twofold. It will be, first of all, we think that Pakistan has the potential to be destructive or destabilizing to that broader region, particularly to India, but also perhaps to that is the U.S. relationship with China. Pakistan has the potential to cause trouble there for all the reasons that I've talked about, for its internal instability, for some of the hostility of groups based in Pakistan against India, and for the possibility that our relationship with Pakistan could go wrong and Pakistan-China relations could stay tight, and that could cause some irritation between us and Beijing. You put these pieces together and you start to understand these interconnections. So that's the Asia, the downside of Pakistan's relationship with Asia. But there's also a much more positive potential. Now, I talked about this enormous youth population and the need for jobs and opportunities and so on. And in the book, I talk a lot about the challenges of direct U.S. assistance to Pakistan. That is, billions of dollars that we've tried to spend to improve their economic potential, to improve the education and so on. And I talk about the challenges to implementation in all of these areas. If we look at other large and medium-sized and even small societies in Asia, we see that their success over the past several decades has usually been driven by their regional economic integration and global economic integration. And my conclusion is that it's only by following that path and by that is the U.S. helping Pakistan to integrate its economy with its neighbors, that we'll see the potential for new investment, for trade, and then jobs and opportunities for this rising, enormous population of young Pakistanis. And that's a positive potential that is for Pakistan itself, and also would allow the rest of Asia, and if you look at a map, you'd see it more clearly, the rest of Asia, that is China, India, and East Asia, connect more fully through to Central Asia and on into the Middle East in ways that I think would be very positive. So that regional economic integration is one suggestion that I have for sort of the positive potential and areas where we can contribute. Let me try to wrap up here by simply saying that in the book I don't present, and in the report too, I don't present a magic bullet solution to Pakistan. I think the thing that we need to come away from this history and this relationship with, the lesson, is that this is much more of a marathon than a sprint. and that it's not going away. That is, all these challenges are not going away, that no solution can be brought to the table in the near term that will allow us to exit from Pakistan or to escape from that set of challenges. And I think that it's a kind of a tragic mindset. And it, again, follows from this Sartre play, and I think it links up nicely with it. That is, things could get significantly worse, and they might. Things won't get all that much better too quickly, and yet we need to understand that we're stuck with this, as Sartre puts it, forever and ever and ever. Now, I know I leave you on that unhappy note, but I think that there are ways that we can manage this relationship more successfully than we have in the past, and I hope we can do so, and I hope the book contributes to that effort. And again, thanks for coming out, and I look forward to your questions. Yes, all the way in the back.
You made this statement about the support for the Pakistani military, which to me seems to connect all the different characterizations of Pakistan, whether it's a basket case, a garrison state, or otherwise. The support of the military has undermined Pakistan and has brought to bear all the problems that we want to avoid. I mean, what explains the huge difference in trajectories of India and Pakistan, both born at the same time, same people, same talents, two countries going in two different directions, if it were not for the support of the Pakistani military? I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about how it has undermined exactly what it was intending to avoid.
And could you summarize
Yeah.
the question?
Yeah, so the question, I think, is, if I understood correct, is sort of a reinforced argument that the military and the military's behavior in Pakistan lies at the core of its problems, effectively, right? And you don't get much of an argument from me on that point. And I would say that the centrality of the Pakistani military to its politics, increasingly over time to its economy, and to certainly for decades its foreign and defense policies cannot be overestimated. But there are a couple of nuances here. I mean, one of them would be, I try in the book to talk about, is Pakistan about to be a revolutionary society? That is it going to undergo in the very near term a collapse, a calamitous collapse? And my short answer is no. Unlike some of the headlines that you might come across in papers and magazines and so on, I say no. And part of the reason I say no is because of the strength of the military. It is both a repressive political force and a source of order in a very disordered society. It has a kind of a dual face to it in that way. So while I completely agree with you that over the long term, the dominance of the military has been a destructive force in Pakistani society, responsible for many of the other ills that I've laid out, at this stage, there is no simple solution to dismantling that. And even as we've looked, say, if we look to the consequences of U.S. support to the Pakistani military, at times when we drew away from the relationship, we withdrew that support, it did not resolve the problems of Pakistan. In many ways, they got worse. I'm thinking about the 1990s, for instance, when you saw significant mismanagement and continued problems inside of Pakistan, and where we were effectively had pulled away and had the country in many ways under sanction and so on. So this is the problem. And when Pakistani intellectuals and liberals and so on make this case, which they do, and I'm very sympathetic to it, my argument has been it is up now to the Pakistani civilian leadership to demonstrate its capabilities, and for us to be supportive of that, its capabilities of governing the country more effectively. And that is the best way that they will gradually raise their profile and power in society and reduce the capacity of the military and keep the military more out of politics. If I had to sketch a more sort of evolutionary path to reduce the military's role, it would be that one. And the more dangerous one, the revolutionary path, is one I think I'm more fearful of, because I don't see it playing to the liberals' advantage. I see it playing to a more violent advantage, which would be worrisome not just to the Pakistani military, but to the rest of us as well. So, yes, sir.
I know this contradicts your whole thesis, but I can't
Yeah,
resist asking.
sure.
what if we did exit from Pakistan? What if we did pull out, withdraw all aid to the military and to civil society, just have an embassy and a branch of the Library of Congress, and that's it? And what would be the downside to us? Not maybe Pakistan, I don't know what
Right.
happened in Pakistan, but
Right.
for the United States, for our national interest.
Exactly. Okay, so you should read chapter 7. I talk about three alternative approaches, and one of them is what I label a defensive insulation, and it is exactly what you just laid out. And I describe how we would try to go about narrowly defending ourselves against some of these, whether it's the terrorist threat or concerns about the nuclear program, and on regional militancy, if we did exactly that, if we basically went to a skeleton embassy staff, cut all military and civilian assistance, basically drew away from all diplomatic exchanges that weren't absolutely necessary, maybe even shut down their Library of Congress acquisitions office. I don't know. I didn't mention that. That was too sensitive a topic. But the problem was twofold. First, I'm fully aware that there may come a time when we will need to do this. That is, I open that chapter, in fact, with a profile of former Pakistani army chief Aslam Beg, who I met with in research for this book. And while he was quite polite in our exchange, he voiced such a hostility toward the United States, such a deep sense of kind of a conspiratorial sense of anti-Americanism, that it led me to conclude that if such an individual actually ended up fully in power in Pakistan, we would have little choice other than to go down that path. Pakistan would be a hostile adversary, more alike to North Korea than it is now. So I'm aware that we may get there. What I would not want to do is to accelerate our path to getting there. I don't see that as a more positive, despite all the frustrations we have with Pakistan. I see that as a less positive place to be than we already are, and also a costly one, because what I lay out as a more comprehensive effort to deal with the threats inside of Pakistan from a distance is a forever campaign, one waged against probably an increasingly hostile country which feels alienated and angered by us, which won't have a serious prospect for bringing about, as we used to say, regime change in a positive way. That's not going to happen. So it's going to go on for decades and decades. And which, as I was talking before, Pakistan is not just a remote, landlocked, small country in the middle of nowhere. It is a large country with porous borders, connections to other important countries, which are going to be very difficult to wall off, to quarantine. And we found this in terms of broader counterterrorism efforts and so on. So it's to say, yes, there's a possibility we may get there. I don't think that we ought to try to get there. I think that the situation would be considerably worse for Pakistanis, for its region, and then ultimately for us. It would be a costly outcome, a perhaps, I think, more costly long-term outcome than attempting to work with the current government, even in a more narrow way, and to promote more positive change, which is what I argue for. Looking for opportunities to tip the scales in a positive direction. And as I talked earlier about regional economic integration, this would be one example. This isn't a matter of us making or fixing Pakistan. This is a matter of us helping to unlock some of the regional potential that may be there. So that's the argument, And again, I'd say take a look at Chapter 7. I hope it's a compelling, perhaps somewhat even scary scenario of what would happen if we went down that path. But I think it's also, I hope, a realistic blueprint for what we would want to do if we had to go down that path. Because I fully concede that we may get there, despite of the fact that I'd prefer we not. So, yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. I think we see Pakistan as a deeply divided nation with strong terrorist roots now. So extremely difficult for United States forces in Afghanistan we pull our forces out of Afghanistan, and what do those revolutionaries in Pakistan do, not only in Afghanistan, but also in their region? And what is the best thing we could do to help Pakistan to maintain some stability and normalcy within the entire region? You bring up Osama bin Laden, which I think is hugely instructive, and the difficulty is no one in Pakistan ever told us he was there, I think. So they have a responsibility also. It's not just the American responsibility, the Americans with drones, the Americans fighting those militants. Pakistan has to come to terms with its own militants. And how do you see them ever doing that?
Well, it's worrisome, and I think it's useful to think about all of the. There's some complexity here in terms of all of the different types of threats that Pakistan thinks it faces, and some it doesn't think it faces, but I think it faces. One, beginning at the lowest level, is the question of the Pakistani Taliban. And if you're following the news now, you'll see that the government of Nawaz Sharif is talking about talks with the Pakistani Taliban. They're also talking a little bit in the background about serious military operations against the Pakistani Taliban, which they've undertaken in the past, but they're talking about even more of them, including in North Waziristan, which is a place they haven't had this kind of more significant military operation in the past, at least not recently. And that is an area where I would say our interest and the Pakistani interests basically overlap. That is, Pakistani Taliban have made it clear they are a threat. They are opposed to the Pakistani state. Pakistani state is opposed to them. They've had violent clashes. And we have, at various points in our relationship, helped the Pakistanis develop military capabilities to deal with that problem, whether it's helicopters, night vision goggles, training, and so on. Some of this has taken place. We could, and I think there are probably conversations about areas where we might be able to do that again in the future. That's at the lowest level. That's where we both see eye to eye on the nature of the problem. As you go up the ladder, though, you see areas, sectarian groups, Sunni versus Shia violence inside of Pakistan cities. Then you go up even further, I would say, to groups of Afghan Taliban based inside of Pakistan. The Pakistanis don't see as a threat to Pakistan. They, in fact, see as a point of leverage for their influence in Afghanistan. I think this is misguided, but this is the way that they've seen it. And you see al-Qaeda, which has fallen, I think, fell for years in the category of, and including bin Laden, too neglected by Pakistanis, known to be a threat to Pakistani leaders. That is, General Musharraf appreciated that al-Qaeda was not on his side, but did way too little, especially after the first several years, to actually address that threat. And then finally, you get to the top level, the most difficult issue, which I mentioned, Lashkar-e-Taiba. This is an organization that has deep roots and interconnections with the Pakistani state. We do not see eye to eye with the Pakistani state about what threat Lashkar-e-Taiba poses, at least not in a deep enough sense to see them take action. Now, our goal, I think, should be to partner with the Pakistanis at that lowest level, where we do see eye to eye. That's a mutual threat. Try to convince them to move up the ladder to see more mutual threats. And then to the extent that we can, address those top-level threats more or less on our own and with other partners who do see them as a problem, including the Indians. But I think we need to categorize in that way and recognize that, we don't see eye to eye with the Pakistanis. We aren't likely to. I've argued there have been certain points in our past decade plus of history where we might convince them otherwise, but we are not going to gradually bring them along. It has to be a point of crisis or vulnerability, which might get them to turn their course of action more significantly. But I'm not especially optimistic of that in the near term. Yes, sir.
My whole experience in Pakistan was going there in the late 80s, early 90s on UN health assignments, so it had nothing to do. But I came away with talking to people there with how magnified from here, people distrusted so much of the government. And how convenient it was for the government, like many other countries, to use opinion about, quote, outsiders. And especially with the tortured history of Pakistan's creation. And so my question is, how, do you see, I sort of thinking of your saying as seeing the glass 1/10 filled and 9/10 empty, and you're an optimist, so you're going with the 1/10 filled.
Yeah, right.
But how that whole interaction of refraining from trying to whip up jingoist feelings and the outsiders, including India, but U.S. is such a convenient topic. How can that sort of Gordian knot be?
It's a great question. I mean, look, recent polls have us a little bit ahead of India in terms of our popularity in Pakistan. But other polls conducted shortly before that have us significantly less popular than India. Now, that's saying something, given their history of war and partition and so on. So the problem of, and I tried to stress this, the origins of anti-Americanism, now this is not new. This is a layering on. I would agree with you. This has often been a manipulation by Pakistani political leaders to sort of deflect, don't look at us, we're not responsible, it's America that's accountable for all of this, and if you have a problem, it's their fault. We've seen this even in significant ways by the current opposition politician, Imran Khan, who has played this game and to his benefit. He's been pretty effective at it. I would say even the Pakistan People's Party, the party that was in power for the first 5 years after Musharraf, as I met with their representatives on the eve of their national election back last May, they were using a lot of kind of anti-American rhetoric and blaming us for their failings, despite the fact that we had provided them with billions of dollars of assistance during their time in office, more than we gave in many ways to their predecessors. I mean, they had our support. So the fact that they could then sort of blame us was deeply worrisome. I don't want to say that I've given up on the idea of winning hearts and minds in Pakistan, but I haven't been impressed by our capacity to tackle that directly. And I have been impressed by the nature of this kind of manipulation and the deeply felt sentiment that's there, that's sort of part of the water, something you just drink there. So what I would say is we probably ought not to get too distracted by that line. That, as I think both governments are trying to do, find more narrow areas of cooperation that we can do, and then chip away at that problem over a long period of time. I mean, it's going to take demonstrated success. We talk about things in our assistance programming like building up power plants or schools or other things. Some of that is appreciated, but not always. And it hasn't, led to a direct shift in views about the United States. So I think over time, that kind of commitment may pay off. And even if it doesn't, we've got to be, and this is where I come back to, 10% left of my glass, I've still got to work with it. And I've still got to figure out ways to better protect us and our interests and deal with the Pakistan that is and that continues to be anti-American in many of its outlooks, but to not overstate the depths of that anti-Americanism. And that's why I talked about different types of anti-American sentiment and where they come from. And how I would say the vast majority of Pakistanis have a problem with our policies, and that over time, if our policies become more aligned, maybe we'll be in better shape. That's where, so it's not a quick and easy
We
solution.
can do one more question here,
Okay.
and then we'll have to
Great.
go to the book signing.
I'll talk to you after, Don. Back there.
Thank you for the presentation and writing the book. I haven't read it, but I'll go forward and read it.
Great.
I don't know if you mentioned the book about feudalism, which is very strong in Pakistan, strongly rooted, as well as they have strong ties with the political system, as well as in the army, as well as in the military. and 70% of the population is in rural areas, not very educated, and I think that is also a key problem with feudalism
Yeah.
in Pakistan. That's the reason that it's not growing. And in terms of differentiating with India, when the countries were born, India had the land reform, Pakistan did not. So
Yeah, no, this is a great point, and it is something that I do write about, and it is also a layering on the broader historical argument about what is different between Pakistan and India. Part of it is, as was the point made earlier, part of it is the dominance of the military in Pakistan, which is quite different from the Indian case. And part of it is this feudal question, the lack of land reform in a significant way, and the continued dominance of a narrow elite, and a lack of a modernizing economy, at least at a pace that would allow urbanized elites to take the place of the old feudal elites, right? Because you could see over time that you would see, the growth of cities, which is happening, and my hope would be that over time you'd see the growth in the power of sort of industrial class, and beyond that, a kind of a mid-level and lower-level entrepreneurial class that would create opportunities to lure the underclasses that are now under the sway of the feudal elites, lure them away and give them other opportunities, give them education. I mean, that's how you would modernize the society. But you haven't seen that fast enough to make up for that, and to make up for that continued dominance of this feudal elite. And in many ways, you've seen the replication of that feudal power in the business area, in politics, and they even extended into the military. So these things become mutually reinforcing, I think, in relatively repressive ways. And that is also a part of the Pakistani story. So.
As I mentioned, we're going to need to continue the conversation with Dan during the book signing, which is very much a part of all Books and Beyond events. Thank you, Dan, for presenting an articulate, balanced, very informative and interesting presentation. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in the back. And I also noticed a little booklet that you have on the side. You want to say a word
I should make a
about
pitch.
that?
I've got a whole. I have about 15 copies of
14 now.
Okay, of my latest report, which comes free whether you buy the book or not.
So let's conclude with a round of applause for Dan Markey and a wonderful job.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.